Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Securing Our Housing Futures, Tenant Protections for Federally Backed Homes. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Trom Huang. I'm a senior associate at PolicyLink based in the Twin Cities on Dakota land, and I'm grateful to be joined today by staff from two organizations that we deeply enjoy working with and who are co-hosting this webinar, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and the National Housing Law Project. And then we're also joined today by the Homes Guarantee Campaign, which we've been all working together with to advance tenant protections at the federal level. So thank you all for joining us, including our guest speakers. So we're all here today because this request for input from the Federal Housing Finance Agency is a historic moment to change the conditions that renters are facing today, in which housing instability due to the power imbalances in our housing system continue to perpetuate inequities, both racial and economic, in our housing system. Landlords have the ability to create and perpetuate uninhabitable living conditions, displace and retaliate against tenants, and egregiously raise rents. And today we have the opportunity to change those conditions. As you've all noticed from recent federal actions, from the White House Blueprint for Renters' Bill of Rights to the CFPB FTC's request for input on tenant screening, Renter Nation is rising and the administration is feeling the pressure to meaningfully act on tenant protections. On May 30th, the Federal Housing Finance Agency opened a request for input regarding multifamily tenant protections, and it can be leveraged for our collective efforts to expand protections to millions of tenants across the country who live in a home with a federally backed mortgage. Next slide, please. Today, we'll be providing you with an overview of topics that will help you submit your own comment to the request for input, whether you're submitting as an individual or an organization. And as you can see here, the deadline to submit a comment is July 31st. So we have a little over a month for you all to get your comments together. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to welcome Tara Raghuveer from the Homes Guarantee Campaign. She'll be grounding us in the organizing movement that has made this moment possible. Then we'll go to Marie-Claire Tran Leung from National Housing Law Project, who will introduce us to the Federal Housing Finance Agency, its role in the housing system, and its power to leverage tenant protections for millions of tenants across the country. Then we'll have Thomas Silverstein from Lawyers Committee, who will walk us through the RFI process. I'll review some of the specific tenant protection policies that we can include in our RFI comments, and then we'll end with some time for Q&A. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom bar at the bottom of your screen to ask some questions. Some of us may be able to answer these questions in the function, and then if not, we can address them in our Q&A section at the end. And to get ahead of our most common question, yes, a recording of this webinar and materials will be made available to everyone who registered and on the PolicyLink website after today. Now, I'm excited to welcome Tara Raghuveer, Director of the Homes Guarantee Campaign, to ground us in this moment and share the story of how tenant organizing has made this wave of federal attention to tenant issues possible.
Thank you, Trom, and hello, everyone. It's great to be on this webinar with so many people who are so interested in something that has been the core of our focus for the last several months. So I want to just ground us by giving a little bit of background on the Homes Guarantee Campaign, what we're seeking, who we are, the tenants that comprise our base, and the work that they've done to set us up for this very exciting moment in federal policy. The Homes Guarantee Campaign is a campaign with a simple premise. We live in the richest country in the history of the world. We can and we must guarantee that everyone has a home. Now, of course, this is a simple premise that is complicated by what we like to call a conspiracy of the profiteers, who have stifled our imagination and convinced us and policymakers that the only way housing can be delivered in this country is if it's delivered as a commodity. We want to see a world where housing is guaranteed as a public good and not treated as a commodity or a vehicle for profiteers to simply make money off of our lives and our neighborhoods. The Homes Guarantee is a campaign that's comprised right now of over 50 tenant unions across the country. Some of the strongest, baddest, most organized tenant unions out there are part of our base. And we have an amazing and growing team of partner organizations, which include some of the co-hosts of this call. Shout out to the National Housing Law Project Policy Link, and many of the other organizations that I know are represented in the chat. Oh, and also the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Thomas has been with us for a long time. So we have a great crew of partners who are supporting us on policy and some of our political and research work. And that has built our campaign and taken us in new and more powerful directions than ever before. So I want to tell you a little bit about the organizing that's led up to this moment and led up to the RFI with FHFA, because it's not a given that we would be at this point if not for the tenant organizing that's been going on for really decades, but concertedly in the last several years. And I do think it's important that whenever we start talking about the homes guarantee, we acknowledge that tenants have been organizing for years and years and years. We're not inventing a new practice of tenant organizing. We're simply responding with clarity and with commitment to a new kind of power because of the depth and the breadth of the crisis that we're in today. For tenants like the tenants in our base across the country, the rent is too damn high and tenants do not have the protections that they need. And I think are increasingly clear on that. That's leading to a resurgence of tenant power across the country. In the last 18 months or 2 years, we've spent a lot of our time engaging with the White House as they've launched what they called an interagency policy council process. And we started bringing tenants like those that are pictured on the screen. That's Harvey Nash from Kansas City, LaMonica Dickerson, and Amber. We brought those tenants and others to DC to engage directly with the White House and other agencies about their needs in their communities and to bring a real ask that the federal government get involved in correcting the imbalance of power between tenants and their landlords. You can see on the right on this slide, we've also done briefings for members of Congress that have led to some really strong leadership from some of our champions in Congress to further encourage executive and agency level action. All of this engagement led to our campaign drafting an executive order that called for a whole of government approach to protect tenants with a focus on rent regulations. And we explored every and any pathway that the federal government could take to do this, including what the Federal Housing Finance Agency could do to condition every dollar of federally backed financing on a set of tenant protections. While this executive order was not signed by the president last year when we brought it to the White House's attention, we did end up calling the question on that federal role in protecting tenants. And that question calling led to a beautiful outcome, which was in January of this year, the White House rolled out their blueprint for tenant protections. And this was the end of the White House Interagency Policy Council process, or at least that phase of it. The blueprint did a number of things or called for a number of things, some of which are kind of more introducing a new framework for tenant protections at the federal level, and some of which are much more concrete. I think, and we think, that the biggest positive outcomes of this blueprint were twofold. One, an acknowledgement of the federal government's role in intervening in that imbalance of power between landlords and tenants, and specifically the federal role in a housing market that has changed really substantially in the last decade as the market has become more and more consolidated and less regulated, and more of us tenants are subjected to these conditions in the private market. So that, we think, is one of the biggest outcomes of the blueprint, is just acknowledging the federal government's role in protecting us in our homes. The second, more concrete outcome of this blueprint is some of these organizing footholds that we'll be spending a lot of time talking about today. Namely, the White House invited the Federal Housing Finance Agency to start investigating what it could do in its power as the regulator of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to protect tenants in their homes. And we were really excited about that. It is my belief that that would not have been in this blueprint if not for the organizing led by Harvey, LaMonica, Amber, and the tenants that we have been bringing to engage the White House. And that's a huge win for our campaign. So let me bring you to the moment that we are in right now. The Federal Housing Finance Agency, as you all know, has launched their request for information about tenant protections. Some of my colleagues on this call will tell you much more about that. The big picture is this. We want every dollar of federally backed financing that goes into the housing industry to come with strings attached. And we want those strings to protect tenants. And we don't think that is a radical premise. We think this is what tenants are owed. And we think it's the most powerful way that the federal government can show up for some of our neighbors and friends and family, and for some of us who are the most vulnerable in our communities. And if we won these protections, they would apply to 1 in 4 apartment units in this country. Millions of households would materially benefit. So I want to just thank all of you in advance for all of the work that you're going to do to help us get this win. It's going to be hugely meaningful. And the thing that I want to close with is a hopeful note, but also an urgent note based on a property visit we did last week with the director of FHFA. We took her to Arlington, Virginia, and we visited a property called Southern Towers. It's 2,300 units. 60% of the units are occupied by Black tenants. 66% are foreign born. Most of the workers at the airports in Virginia and the area, as well as the service industry, live in these buildings. And these buildings were financed by a $346 million Freddie Mac loan in 2020. And within the first 6 months of the acquisition of this property using federal financing, the landlord, CIM Group, filed evictions against 250 of the tenants and increased the rent 9% across the board. And that, by the way, is not an exception. We believe that is representative of the business practice of most of the landlords who are benefiting from some form of federal financing. And the implications, if we do not regulate the behaviors of those landlords, are really severe for tenants like Tariq, one of the tenants who we met last week, who showed us around the property with the director of FHFA. For Tariq, unfortunately, it's already too late. His rent has been hiked, and he's an Uber driver who got sick and lost his only source of income while he was dealing with his illness. He's already been evicted, but he participated in this visit last week because he knew that he had a message to deliver to the director that these types of protections are absolutely necessary for him and for members of his community, even as he himself doesn't know where he's going to live next and his boxes are already packed. So again, I just want to say thank you for being here, for having our backs, and for everything that we're going to do together in the next several months to make sure that we win these necessary protections.
Thank you so much. And thanks to your leadership and also the leadership of the 50+ tenant unions around the country that have made this moment possible. Next, I'm going to pass it over to Marie Claire, who's going to introduce us to the Federal Housing Finance Agency.
Thank you, Tram, and thanks, Tara, for grounding us in the experiences of the tenants and giving us context for why this process is so important. I have had the fortunate experience of working alongside with Homes Guarantee over the past year, and have just marveled at the progress that has been made during that time. I want to also thank PolicyLink for inviting me here today and being a great partner in this space. And I do want to, I'm looking at the participant list and see a lot of folks who are part of the Housing Justice Network, and just want to do a brief shout out to you all and hope that you all will be able to offer some of your perspectives as legal services attorneys and advocates that are helping tenants on the ground. So again, my name is Marie Claire Tran-Leung. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Evictions Initiative Project Director at the National Housing Law Project. Today, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the Federal Housing Finance Agency. So next slide, please. So the Federal Housing Finance Agency is an independent federal agency that was created in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And it is tasked with overseeing, among other banking institutions, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And today we'll focus on FHFA's oversight of the two of those. They're otherwise known as government-sponsored enterprises, or the GSEs. Next slide. So to understand what FHFA does, it helps to understand the basics of a mortgage and the secondary mortgage market and how Fannie and Freddie fit in. Probably more than a year ago, this was not necessarily a space that I had worked a lot in as a housing attorney, but I think through the organizing and a lot of conversations, we're seeing how important of a leverage this is for tenants. So on the left, just have a little description of mortgages generally. This is very, very simple and high level for the audience today. So landlords get mortgages from banks to buy property. And most of us know that the mortgage is a loan that the landlord, as the borrower, has to pay back over time to the bank through monthly mortgage payments. So banks hold these mortgages, but they don't necessarily want to hold on to them for too long. They want to be able to make other loans, and holding on to mortgages does not enable them to do that. And so this is where Fannie and Freddie, the GSEs, come in. Fannie and Freddie buy mortgages from the banks, and then the banks can use the cash from selling the mortgages to make more loans. And this creates liquidity in the market and facilitates lending in the housing finance system. And this is what we call the secondary mortgage market. So when Fannie and Freddie buy mortgages from the banks, they usually can only buy mortgages that meet certain criteria. And we'll return to examples of this later, but this in particular is an important way where there is an opportunity for tenant protections to be inserted into the federally backed mortgage process. Fannie and Freddie then pool those mortgages into mortgage-backed securities and then sell those securities to investors. Those investors want to buy those securities because essentially Fannie and Freddie are guaranteeing that they'll get the monthly payments on the underlying mortgages. So this is a lot of information, but I think for us, one of the main takeaways is that the banks don't want to hold on to the mortgages. They do want Fannie and Freddie to buy them. And so imposing criteria on the purchases of those loans is an important avenue, I think, of creating tenant protections in this space. So that's Fannie and Freddie. How does FHFA fit in here? Next slide, please. So FHFA is really tasked with overseeing Fannie and Freddie. So we talked about, we have the borrower who's the landlord, and above them is they work with the banks to get the mortgages. Above the banks is Fannie and Freddie who buy those mortgages, and then FHFA oversees Fannie and Freddie. FHFA's oversight is both as a regulator and a conservator. And one example where FHFA exercises that authority is by setting the criteria for mortgages that the GSEs can buy from the banks. And again, a place where tenant protections, we're looking at thinking about tenant protections through federally backed mortgages. FHFA has also established a couple of strategic goals that I want to emphasize here. One is that one of their goals is to ensure that the GSEs operate in a safe and sound manner. And one of the ways to do that is to prevent them from making risky investments. The second is to foster housing finance markets that promote equitable access to affordable and sustainable housing. So equitable access can mean increasing equitable home ownership, but it also means increasing equitable access for renters to affordable and sustainable housing. So given those strategic goals, we really see creating and strengthening tenant protections as falling within those goals. Next slide, please. So there is some history of FHFA increasing tenant protections through its oversight of Fannie and Freddie. And it's not extremely extensive, but it creates good precedent, I think, for us as we go into this RFI process. So we'll start with the pandemic era tenant protections. In the early months of the pandemic, FHFA used its conservatorship authority to help tenants protect tenants from evictions if their landlords participated in a voluntary mortgage forbearance program. So essentially, if a landlord chose to request a pause in their mortgage payments, they in turn had to promise not to evict their tenants for the duration of the pause. Especially in the first couple of months, that was something that was directed by FHFA to the GSEs. In addition, during the pandemic, there was the CARES Act eviction moratorium, which covered tenants of federally backed mortgages. This wasn't necessarily an FHA initiative, but FHFA did have to engage in the implementation of this moratorium and took action like creating lookup tools for tenants to see whether their properties were had federally backed mortgages and were covered by the moratorium. Next slide, please. So those were the pandemic era protections, but there are also existing tenant protections today that help create some precedent for what we are asking for, what we plan to ask for in the RFI. Here, through its regulatory powers, FHFA imposed certain tenant protections in manufactured housing. So earlier I talked about how FHFA could set criteria for mortgages that the GSEs could purchase from the banks. And in the manufactured housing setting, for GSEs to purchase loans, the loan terms have to include the following protections for tenants. The first one being, and I'll go through this list here, the first one being a 1 year renewable lease term, unless there is good cause for non-renewal, a 30-day written notice of rent increases, 5-day grace period for rent payments, and the right to cure defaults on rent payments. And there are also several rights that are for tenants that are specific to the manufactured housing space. But one of them I wanted to discuss here was the right to receive at least 60 days of advance notice of a planned sale or closure of the manufactured housing community. So this is a good example where FHFA has created tenant protections through federally backed mortgages. Though I think a lot of our colleagues who work in the manufactured housing space will attest to, there's a lot of room for FHFA to build upon these protections in manufactured housing, and the RFI presents an opportunity to make the case for that here. Next slide, please. So the last couple of existing tenant protections I wanted to go over is first the CARES Act 30-day eviction notice requirement. This essentially requires the landlords to provide a 30-day notice to tenants before initiating an eviction action. It is a requirement under federal law that continues today, and FHFA took actions to implement this by requiring Fannie and Freddie to include and incorporate the notice requirement into their loan agreements. And lastly, FHFA and Fannie and Freddie most recently, in I think January or February of this year, increased radon testing requirements for multifamily housing, helping to increase the health and safety of tenants. So as you can see, there's precedent for FHFA to impose tenant protections. And we hope to convince FHFA to create more tenant protections through federally backed mortgages. So with that, I'll turn things over to Tom, who will talk about how FHFA's request for input provides an avenue for that.
Thanks, Marie-Claire, and thanks to Policy Link for having me on this webinar, and also to Tara Ragavir. My name is Thomas Silverstein. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Associate Director of the Fair Housing and Community Development Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a request for input or request for information in general, and what is going on with this particular one. We go to the next slide. So a request for input, which in the context of most other agencies is usually called a request for information. So you might hear the two terms interchangeably, also called an RFI. It's a process for agencies to seek input from the public in order to guide their policymaking. And typically through a notice and comment process. Here, in the case of this RFI, we have a 60-day notice and comment period. Sometimes RFIs may get confused with two other processes through which agencies solicit comment, notices of proposed rulemaking and advance notices of proposed rulemaking. RFIs are a little bit more preliminary than those steps, where you're more directly leading into the regulatory or rulemaking process. But RFIs also, and perhaps more significantly here, are designed to guide a wider range of different policymaking steps than just rulemakings. So on the slide, I identify agency guidance as one type of non-rulemaking or non-regulatory outcome that can emerge from an RFI, but also, sort of more, internal agency programmatic decision-making, things that might turn up in manuals or handbooks, things that might turn up in, contractual language that, someone like the GSEs are required to use, may not necessarily take the shape of a rule. But an RFI can also spur rulemaking down the road. Can we go to the next slide? So Tara laid the groundwork well for the White House's January 2023 announcement on renters' rights. This RFI directly follows up on that announcement. And I think it also, that announcement sets the sort of political context for this RFI. Sometimes RFIs may not have a lot of teeth to them because the agency isn't deciding on a particular action through the RFI, but where an agency is undertaking an RFI specifically to do what the White House instructed the agency to do, I think that gives a little bit more confidence and a little bit more reason for belief that there really is an intent for tangible policy outcomes to emerge from the RFI process. And as Marie-Claire noted, with FHFA, we're talking about a very significant chunk, up to upwards of 25% of the rental housing market. So depending on what sorts of policy outcomes the FHFA arrives at, sort of informed by the RFI process, the impact of those policy outcomes could be quite extensive. Can we move on to the next slide? Before starting to go over the questions that are in the RFI a little bit, I do want to take a step back and talk about what's in the RFI that isn't the questions themselves. So there's some background, which really sort of overlaps extensively with what Marie-Claire presented, sort of a basic, what is the FHFA? What are the GSEs? What do they do? What do they do that's sort of relevant to the rental housing market? There's also some description in the RFI of what the FHFA and the GSEs are already doing to protect tenants' rights. Again, that content in the RFI is overlaps extensively with what Marie-Claire just presented, including, touching upon the pad lease protections for manufactured homeowners. So that's sort of the sort of prefatory material before you get into the questions. There also, of course, is information about how to submit a comment. I think Trom will probably talk a little bit more about the mechanics of how to submit a comment later on. But I'm going to pivot now to the questions. The meat of the RFI, the substance of the RFI, is a series of questions on which the agency is soliciting input. There are 28 questions. This slide and the slides that follow will show on the screen all of those questions. I am not going to go over all of those questions in detail. I also want to really stress that it is not critical for you as potential commenters to comment on every question. You can pick and choose. You don't need to, strain your capacity to weigh in on every question. Also, as you look at these questions, it won't take you too long to realize that there's a lot of overlap between the questions. So, in taking on specific questions in terms of how you frame your response, you're going to end up addressing some of the other questions as well. And part of that is because some of the questions are pretty general and then some are pretty specific. So if you answer, for instance, question A1, how should the enterprises protect tenants in multifamily rental housing? What role should the enterprises play in providing tenant protections at enterprise-backed multifamily properties? There are, I don't know, probably, a third to half of the questions in the RFI are different, more specific variations on this question. So almost everything you'll say in relation to most of the questions will answer this one too. So that's just a sort of general piece of guidance. You can afford to pick and choose. You can also structure your comments around the way that you want to frame the issues and incidentally touch on their questions. You don't have to framed your comment letter as, question and answer. You have, some pride of authorship in terms of how you structure the response. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the questions and some of the themes. So first of all, the 28 questions, they're divided into, I believe we have 4 different categories of, 5 different categories of questions that the 28 questions fall into. Some of the questions are quite broad, as I mentioned. Some of them are very specific. Some of them are also sort of clearly designed to provide a platform for tenant advocates and tenant organizers and tenants themselves to really make the affirmative case for the reality we want to see. And then some of them you'll see are either sometimes bordering on explicitly, but at least implicitly more catering towards industry and giving industry an opportunity to air some of the sort of predictable objections to tenant protections that you might see. So to just give you an example of this, question A1, although it's very broad, is a question that's framing is, I think, very conducive to us making the affirmative case for tenant protections. Because it says, how should the enterprises protect tenants in multifamily rental housing? Embedded in that question is a presumption that they should be doing it. The question is not whether, it's how, right? So this is a question where we can be on the front foot, making our affirmative case for why tenant protections are necessary. But then if you look down to question A4, how might requiring tenant protections at enterprise-backed multifamily properties impact housing supply, including new construction? This is a question that has implicit in it the idea that the agency is anticipating industry folks and landlords saying, you can't do this because if you do this, it will stifle production and we won't have enough housing supply and housing costs will go up because there's not enough supply. That sort of supply and demand logic is something that I think the FHFA is likely anticipating from industry. It's something that we're anticipating from industry. And it's something where, in response to this question, it is likely that industry, trade associations, and perhaps individual landlords, and maybe even some folks in the mortgage banking industry, they might say, don't go overboard with tenant protections because it's going to stifle supply. So one of the things that we have to fight back against, I think, is the idea that tenant protections are going to restrict supply. And also we have to fight back on the idea that there are, sort of hard decisions to make about trade-offs here. So there's an affirmative case to be made that the tenant protections that we're fighting for are perfectly consistent with expanded housing supply. That there are places across the country that have had tenant protections for decades. New Jersey is often an example that folks use that have seen, more robust housing production than in many of their sort of neighboring jurisdictions, even having plenty of jurisdictions that have rent control on the local level, having state law restrictions on unconscionable rent increases and having just cause protections. So it's something where the question presumes an outcome that isn't what we want, but we have the ability to fight fire with fire and make a different case. Can we go on to the next slide? So many of the I think most high priority protections that we will be emphasizing, maybe things around things like just cause protection and rent regulation, restrictions on unreasonable excessive rent increases. But there are multiple facets to protecting tenants aside from those sort of core tenant protections. And some of them are on the front end, right? Some in relation to tenant screening. So the questions in B1, I think really give an opportunity to talk about things like source of income discrimination, restrictions or policies that deny housing to folks who have eviction records or records of past conviction or arrest. And this is, I think, a really important and strategic area to engage, in part because there's so much else going on across the federal government in relation to tenant screening right now. So, the CFPB and other agencies, the FTC, are engaging in regulatory and agency action around and fact gathering around tenant screening as we speak. So there's a real case to be made for how the FHFA should be coordinating its approach to tenant screening along with those agencies, and also drawing a harder line with borrowers who have GSE-backed mortgages, because as Tara said earlier on, this is the public's money. This is these are our precious public resources, and they shouldn't be going out the door without strings attached. If you want a federally backed mortgage, you should not be engaging in policies that undermine another major federal housing program like the Housing Choice Voucher Program. You should not be undermining our goals as a society in terms of successful reentry in ways that could spur homelessness through overly restrictive background screening. Move on to the next slide. So the third category, access to information, I think gets to another key area, which I think all tenant organizers and lawyers who work with tenant organizers have encountered over the years, which is that landlords use complex legal structures to shield the true identities of their owners from tenants in ways that help evade responsibility and accountability. So this category gives some opportunity to weigh in on sort of disclosure and sort of to try to push towards a federal rental registry, if only in regards to the GSE-backed market. It also helps drive towards clarity and transparency in lease terms and provisions as well. Move on to the next slide. Here, with tenant housing stability, this is an opportunity, I think, both to think about eviction diversion, as well as to think about habitability and safety. I think there's here a lot of lessons learned that folks have absorbed, particularly through the COVID-19 pandemic, where that sort of practical experience of what worked to avoid evictions at the height of COVID be helpful in forming the agency's perspective here. And we can move on to, I think, the last slide. So here is, I mentioned earlier with that supply question, I think it was A4, that there's some fodder for industry. I think here, these are a set of questions where it is likely that industry will weigh in and say, this is going to, undermine liquidity of the market. This is going to increase risk of default for landlords because they're not getting their return on investment. Those are the types of typical, predictable stories that we'll hear from the other side here. But I think there's also a narrative to be told about the ways in which frequent turnover of tenants, destabilizing effects on communities and whatnot are also not good in a systemic way for communities and for the GSEs and for the federal government writ large, in addition to not being good for tenants. And with that, I will pass it back to Trom.
Thank you so much. Thank you both to Thomas and Marie-Claire for grounding us in kind of the legal analysis of the Federal Housing Finance Agency and helping us to understand how it is that they have the power to enforce these tenant protections and how we can go about making a difference with our comment. So I am going to really briefly cover how to submit your comment. It's very straightforward. It's actually a little bit easier than a notice of proposed rulemaking through the Federal Register if you've all gone through that process. All you have to do is go to the FHFA website, which I'll put in the chat, and in order to submit your comment. So that is where you can submit your comment. And then because the RFI has been open for a little over 2 weeks now, there have actually been many comments that have been submitted. And so I will also paste a link in the chat for you all to read the comments that have already been submitted. Okay, so now I'll spend a few minutes covering some of the tenant protections Oh, yes, sorry. Can you go one? Yes, right here is perfect. Thanks, Jasmine. So when you go to the FHFA website, they have many RFIs open at any point in time. So you just want to use the drop-down menu to select tenant protections, and that's where you can submit your comments specifically for this request for input. All right, so now I'm going to go over some of the tenant protections that we can push for through this RFI. As we've heard from Marie Claire and Thomas, this is a really powerful opportunity, and I want us to look at some of the numbers to understand why. So if we go to the next slide, please. One more, I'm going to skip this for time. So this graph shows how much of the country's entire loan market are FHFA loans. And here you can see that in 2021, FHFA loans represented 35% of all loans that were originated. That covers over 12 million rental units, which is about 28% of all rental units. And that's the scale of impact that FHFA tenant protections could have. And given both the racial homeownership gap and the racial wealth gap, we know that advancing tenant protections, especially ones that impact evictions and housing affordability, will disproportionately benefit renters of color and therefore advance racial equity. And there are so many tenant protections that we could be pushing FHFA to implement and enforce in our comment letters. I'll be covering just some of the demands we could be making, and I encourage all of you to expand on that in your comments. I'm going to try to breeze through this so that we can have time for Q&A, but please remember that you'll have access to these slides later. So let's go to the next slide. So one thing, oh yes, this is a summary of all the tenant protections I'll be going over. And one more, please. Something that we can all recommend FHFA to do is require owners of federally backed buildings to implement and enforce improved tenant screening practices, ones that limit the impact of credit history, eviction record, and criminal record, for example, due to the disproportionate harm that those tenant screening tools have on renters of color and other protected groups. And this can reinforce what many of us communicated to the CFPB and the FTC in the recent RFI on tenant screening. Next, we can also recommend that FHFA require standardized fair leases with some of the components listed here. Next slide, please. Thank you. And some of those examples are having at least a 10-day grace period to pay rent before a late fee is assessed. Though some states do have standardized leases, we should see those as a floor with FHFA regulations going further to protect tenants. Next slide. We can also demand that FHFA prohibit discrimination against renters based on their source of income in buildings with FHFA-backed mortgages. And we know from research that SOI discrimination laws do work to increase the likelihood of housing choice vouchers finding a place to live. Next slide. This has been touched on by a few folks, and it's especially a big one for renters. It was even explicitly named in the White House blueprint, which included language saying, increases in rent should be reasonable, with the acknowledgement that rents may need to increase to cover operating costs. These increases should be transparent and fair to protect against gouging. So following that, one of the recommendations that everyone can be including in their comment is for FHFA to prohibit landlords with federally backed mortgages from imposing predatory and egregious rent increases. In other words, implementing a rent stabilization or regulation policy. And because those policies can range so widely, we see state policies, for example, that cap rent at CPI +7, which is very high. And then we see other cities with, 75% of CPI or 3%, whichever is lower. Because there's such a broad range of those policies, if you are naming rent regulations, I highly suggest being as explicit as possible about the kind of policy that you want FHFA to enact. Next slide, please. So just cause also pairs very well with rent regulation because together they protect tenants from no-cause evictions and economic evictions, which we know can be discriminatory or retaliatory. We'll go to the next slide. Tenant right to counsel is also a big one. So we can recommend that the tenant right to counsel is expanded to tenants of federally backed homes. This is also a protection that's explicitly named in the White House blueprint with the following language. Quote, if an eviction is filed, tenants should be given 30 days notice of an eviction action and the right to counsel during an eviction proceeding. And that would have huge impacts if we were able to expand that to over 12 million homes. Next, please, is tenant right to organize. So this is one important demand that can be made guaranteeing tenants of homes with federally backed mortgages the right to organize. There's a lot of precedent for this within federal housing programs. And as we all know, tenants coming together to enforce their housing rights is much more powerful, effective, and less scary for the individual than going it alone. Next slide. So habitability is an important issue that can also be addressed in the RFI, and we should be encouraging FHFA to articulate a clear set of habitability standards that borrowers must comply with. HUD's housing quality standards for the Housing Choice Voucher Program is an example of the standards that could be modeled. And then the next slide, we'll look at rental registries. And my apologies for rushing through this. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. In our RFIs, we can also demand for transparency and ownership through landlord or rental registries, asking for all rental properties with federally backed mortgages to be listed in a registry that is publicly searchable and accessible to the public. And it can require specific information from landlords, including beneficial owner information rather than just LLC information. Next slide, please. So this is a policy that looks a little bit further into the future, but it considers the many aspects of the housing justice movement related to decommodification and social housing. If FHFA were to incorporate a tenant or community opportunity to purchase for buildings with federally backed mortgages, it would open the door for tenant unions, local or state governments, and nonprofit developers to purchase buildings to create and preserve affordable housing opportunities out of buildings that are already in our housing supply. And then one more slide, please. So with all of the tenant protections that I just mentioned, we know that proactive enforcement is vital for them to have meaningful impact. So it's important to accompany any demand for new policy with a mechanism to implement and enforce effectively. As such, we can all recommend the creation of an Office of Tenant Protections. This office could receive complaints of violations, investigate and require corrective action, and be responsible for ensuring that FHFA has effective oversight systems to track compliance of various protections. Next slide. So I know we went over a lot there. I just wanted to share this collection of resources, many of which come from our organizational partners that you can all refer to when crafting your comment. And with that, I'm going to transition to a Q&A with our speakers. We'll have time for a few questions before we close. And I also see that folks have been answering questions in the Q&A function, which I am very grateful for. All right, let me see what's in the Q&A. And Marie Claire and Thomas, please feel free to chime in. So we have a question from Sherry saying, some landlords are opting for non-renewals versus evictions. Are there any protections for the tenant on non-renewal?
I can start and Tom can jump in. I mean, I think that first of all, I think it's helpful for FHFA to hear from folks that they need to be looking both at evictions and lease non-renewals. FHFA is an agency that doesn't typically work in the tenant protection space versus like a HUD. And so it's helpful for them to get a lot of context on what people are seeing on the ground. So just wanted to make a plug for that. And I think one of the big asks that we are making is around good cause and just cause and making sure that there are protections for lease non-renewal. But Tom, I don't know if you want to answer that.
I would just add on that, you know, we'll see what the FHFA ultimately ends up doing, but it's encouraging that the pad lease protections for manufactured homeowners do include just cause. It shows that it's a concept that FHFA is already familiar with, so that it should not be as difficult to communicate to them the need for protection against you know, non-renewals under those sorts of circumstances as it would be if it were a totally unfamiliar concept.
Thank you both. The next question we have is kind of a big picture question. What is the incentive for the Federal Housing Finance Agency? And I think this goes a little bit more back to its purposes and why it was created. But if either of you could speak to the incentive for the Federal Housing Finance Agency to actually create and implement these tenant protections.
I can start. So, I mean, I think there's a couple layers to this. So first, it's important to note that the FHFA is not a private sector, for-profit company. This is a government agency. And it's ultimately, politically accountable. Its directors appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. So the push for renters' rights is something that's coming from the White House. We had this January 2023 announcement. And there's a political incentive for the FHFA to participate in the process of improving and enhancing and protecting renters' rights because it's part of the executive branch of the government. It's responsive to the president in material ways, and the president has said that this is important. I think the other piece is, and this goes back to, and Marie-Claire can elaborate upon it, but goes back to the sort of the strategic vision, this sort of overall strategic framing of the FHFA's work. Part of that, relates to affordability in the housing market, and we know that many of the types of landlord practices that tenant protections would help to curb are very harmful in terms of affordability in the housing market. So that's also a sort of aspect of the push for tenants' rights and tenant protections, where the FHFA should feel an institutional push and hopefully obligation to act.
Yeah, I mean, back to sort of the strategic goals that I talked about earlier, FHFA is interested in making sure that there is money flowing through the housing finance market so that banks can make loans and homes can be purchased. But that's not its only goal. Its goal is also to foster a market that promotes equitable access to affordable and sustainable housing. So it has that sort of dual mission. And I think that's actually one place where when people are making their comments, it's helpful to lean into that mission-oriented goal of FHFA. I think that a lot of folks who might oppose the tenant protections in the space might make some of the arguments about the impact on the market generally. And we know that the FHFA is not the only goal of the FHFA.
Thank you. Next, we have a question that I can take. It is a question about rent. So what is considered reasonable rent? That's a great question. I think this is where a lot of advocacy is needed to push for a strong rent regulation, right? We see a variety of rent regulations across the country. Pasadena, for example, just won 75% of CPI on the ballot, and state legislatures in Oregon and California have much higher. So it really is kind of dependent on the policy maker. And that's why I encourage all of you to, when you do recommend a policy in your request for input comment, to be as specific as possible. So for example, if you're fighting for a local policy in your jurisdiction, you can describe what those details are so that FHFA can consider the range of strength of policies that can exist. Okay, I think we have time for one or two more. This is a good one. Do you have any information on what is in FHFA's jurisdiction and what's not? Do you have a brief list of what should not be included in the RFI? And that is kind of a tough one. So we might have to get back to you on that, but I'm going to open it up and see if Thomas and Marie-Claire have some thoughts.
So I don't think it's so much a question of what should or shouldn't be included in terms of types of protections. It's more a question of what segment of the market do they have the ability to impact. So, they're not going to be able to create protections that apply to properties that don't have GSE-backed mortgages, right? But within the scope of what could be applied to properties with GSE-backed mortgages, government-sponsored enterprise-backed mortgages, I think that in theory, there's a broad range that they can impose, in part because, as Marie-Claire said earlier, we're dealing both with FHFA's power as a regulator, but also as a conservator, which is a theoretically broader range of power as a conservator. And there haven't been cases in terms of litigation saying what are the absolute outer limits of those powers. So I think we should be pushing for an expansive view of what is within those powers.
Yeah, I agree with what Tom said, and I think it also linking it back to Tom's presentation. The request for input is a little bit different than an rule, like the sort of proposed rulemaking process. And so I do think that FHFA is trying to get a full sense of what the problems are, and there will be an opportunity. I mean, to the extent that folks have very specific policy recommendations that they want to make, they should. But I also think because FHFA has limited experience, has good experience, but very limited experience in the tenant protection space, it is very, very helpful for them to hear about what some of the issues are. The other thing that I want to note is, part of our work has been, and I think Tara said this earlier, trying to make sure that the federal government understands that it has a role in creating tenant protections. There, I think historically has been a desire, we have heard from some federal policymakers that this is just best left to the states and localities, but I know there's a lot of people on this call who are in states where that simply is not an avenue for strengthening tenant protection. So again, just making sure that FHFA understands sort of the context that tenants are living in right now.
Thank you both. We are close to out of time for today, so I want to take a moment to mention a few things before we end. And the first is kind of echoing what Thomas said about writing your comment, which is you don't have to answer every question. I think collectively we will all send in comments that address different aspects of the RFI. And then also, more importantly, many of us will have direct tenant experiences that we can speak to say, this is what I'm facing, and others might not have that experience, but they might have the policy or legal experience to say, these are the policies that are needed. So if you are feeling like you don't have the ideal or quote unquote perfect comment, there's no such thing. Whatever you can share with FHFA in terms of your experience or what you think could be useful is important. And we can trust that if all 100 of us on this webinar are submitting a comment, we'll have a very well-rounded set of information for FHFA to reflect on. And so with that, I want to thank all of you for joining and thank our co-hosts and guest speakers for joining us today. And I want to remind you to do two things. First is, of course, submit your comment to the FHFA by July 31st. And second, if you wouldn't mind taking a post-webinar survey, it would be great to hear what you all have in terms of feedback for us so that we can create better webinars for you all in the future for opportunities like this. So again, please submit your comment by July 31st, and we'll follow up in the next few days with a webinar recording as well as resources. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.